of people who are in transition, and as technologies take certain jobs out, there's always that little transitional unemployment.
Okay, like one of our major concerns as Occupy is the imbalance of distribution of wealth.
Yes.
And the way that you attack that problem has been attacked over the centuries by all sorts of people in all sorts of ways, from communist, socialist, capitalist, free market, various almost political aspects to the economic picture.
Yes.
And that's what interests me is where are we going to take our economic system from here? And understanding it down to the last detail, I can understand is important, but not as important to me as the vision of where we want it to go. And I think you're talking about the limitations. You cannot defy the math, you cannot defy the statistics. Economics is like, it is what it is. You can't argue about it. It's the math.
Well, parts of it are.
But I'm concerned about the argument. Parts of how are we going to have distributed wealth in this world in a more equitable and fair manner.
I have the exact topic for that, and how about we do part on this and the other part on that? Would you? I actually have two specific topics that directly address that, and one of the reasons that I want to get this type of knowledge in people's heads is for them to realize that mathematically that can work. You can have a society that's developed around these things because the ones that we can't move, if we can move stuff around and ratchet levers. There are ways to ratchet levers and make things work the way you want them to. Obviously, the 1% has used those levers to move things the way they wanted to, and they've been incredibly successful at doing that. When you look at the things that they say on television about how economics works, like this trickle-down effect, that's not mathematical. Like there's no trickle-down equation for how that works. It's pure bullshit. That is not trickle-down. Is not a theory. There's no. It's like saying, that if you do, a lot of them they say, well, if you do this, if you cut taxes, that creates more jobs. Well, that's not true either. That's not. Each time we have done that, that is not shown to happen. In fact, a lot of times the opposite happens.
The evidence is otherwise, but the people with the ideology say, I don't really care about the evidence. My ideology
recently captured somebody knock a water
and at that point in time, you've left economics entirely. Really, you're saying it's economics, but you're completely like in a different world.
And we're trapped in that a bit in the public sphere. Who's giving us our information? Who is people who probably don't know anything about it? And the experts and so on are all kind of pushed aside as eggheads or liberals or whatever, and we get a steady diet of privilege, falsehood, lies, deception. And we're looking for a way to fight that without getting bogged down. That my fear is to become bogged down in details frustrates the goal.
I have to say, you are inspiring me to change topics. Are you familiar with Bertrand Russell?
I love Bertrand.
Are you familiar with In Praise of Idleness?
I've heard of it, but I
okay, well, I want to read everyone. This is an interesting. He was a philosopher. Bertrand Russell, amazing thinker.
A mathematician.
He was Bertrand Russell.
Definitely.
Actually, maybe we will look up Bertrand Russell first.
Then I've lost the question, and I don't know exactly what you were going to teach or not, but like I kind of sympathize with like socialist viewpoints, and people are telling me all the time that like, well, socialism would never be able to work. Is that really true?
It does work.
Well, hold on. There's issues with
what's the meaning
aspects
of life?
of it.
Stop. Sorry.
issues of aspects.
I feel so sorry for you.
There's also, see, remember I told you as soon as I did the Fed talk that I was expecting the Fed talk to be completely derailed within like 15 minutes. Because like
worms.
if you do a Fed talk, but everyone was really receptive to like just hearing the mechanical stuff and it was good that we got the historical stuff in there too. So you can see that, like, I agree that I call shenanigans on the whole operation, the way it's been run and the way that it was constructed, because obviously it was constructed with the 1% in mind. I mean, that's not under dispute. It's they themselves said it was constructed
very proud.
with them in mind.
Yeah, actually. Yeah.
You know, they didn't know the internet was going to happen. They didn't figure, past the time they got away with it, they didn't figure anybody would remember it, you know, in years. Nobody reads history. So, well, first, let me get to Bertrand Russell. Was actually what is he? He's one of the founders of analytic philosophy. He led the British revolt against idealism. I am not actually familiar with that. He was a philosopher, logician, mathematician, historian, and social critic. And at times in his life, he considered himself a liberal, socialist, and a pacifist. But he also admitted that he had never been any of those things in any profound sense. So he's a unique mind, essentially. Like he has some things in common with those things, and at the same time, he had his own opinions on those things and did not necessarily agree. And I think at least all of us that are here, and probably anybody watching this video, has their own opinions that do not agree with any particular structural framework that anyone else has articulated. You don't agree with 100% of it. There's always a percentage that you really want to be slightly different. And that's kind of part of what we're trying to figure out, how we can all coexist within that.
Finding the common ground.
But I heard this joke about that. And I just wanted to tell, sorry, I'm just this is so timely. Is that this really heavy set guy in a buffet line? He had like two plates on each arm, and he's just loading them up. And the guy's behind him going, "Man, you keep eating like that, you're not going to live very long." And he said, "You know what? My dad lived to the age of 112, or my grandfather lived to the age of 112. So he didn't get that old eating like that." He said, "You know how he did get that old?" He said, "Wow, minding your own damn business." So that was kind of like a little bit of us not being quite as offended by stuff that's not really our business, kind of stuff. I think it's a good just thing to teach. It's like, okay, well, you know, you don't like that? Okay, well, don't do that.
Yeah.
You know, let them go do that over there.
You don't like gay marriage? Don't.
Yeah. Don't get gay marriage.
Don't get gay.
You don't like abortion? Don't get abortion.
Yeah, and it's just a little bit more of like, there's no one right way to live, and we shouldn't try to pretend like there is. So, but this is a really good. I'm glad we have such a small group that we can kind of go wildly off track and just do whatever's interesting. This is something he wrote, and this is directly pertaining because he knew about economics as well as philosophy. And this is an interesting perspective. This was written in 1932, take into account. It says, "Like most of my generation, I was brought up on the saying, Satan finds some mischief for idle hands to do. Being a highly virtuous child, I believed all that I was told and acquired a conscience which kept me working hard down to the present moment. But although my conscience has controlled my actions, my opinions have undergone a revolution. I think that there is far too much work done in the world, that immense harm is caused by the belief that work is virtuous, and that what needs to be preached in modern industrial countries is quite different from what always has been preached. Everyone knows the story of the traveler in Naples who saw 12 beggars lying in the sun. It was before the days of Mussolini." He likes to throw the little jabs in there. "And offered a lira to the laziest of them. 11 of them jumped up to claim it, so he gave it to the 12th. This traveler was on the right line." This traveler was on the right lines. But in countries which do not enjoy Mediterranean sunshine, idleness is more difficult, and a great public propaganda will be required to inaugurate it. I hope that, after reading the following pages, the leaders of the YMCA will start a campaign to induce good young men to do nothing. If so, I shall not have lived in vain. Before advancing my own arguments for laziness, I must dispose of one which I cannot accept. Whenever a person who already has enough to live on proposes to engage in some everyday kind of job, such as school teaching or typing, he or she is told that such conduct takes the bread out of other people's mouths and is therefore wicked. If this argument were valid, it would only be necessary for us all to be idle in order that we should have our mouths full of bread. What people who say such things forget is that what a man earns, he usually spends, and in spending he gives employment. As long as a man spends his income, he puts just as much bread into people's mouths in spending as he takes out of other people's mouths in earning. The real villain from this point of view is the man who saves. If he merely puts his savings in a stocking, like the proverbial French peasant, it is obvious that they do not give employment. If he invests his savings, the matter is less obvious, and different cases arise. One of the commonest things to do with savings is to lend them to some government. In view of the fact that the bulk of the public expenditure of most civilized governments consists in payment for past wars or preparation for future wars, the man who lends his money to a government is in the same position as the bad men in Shakespeare who hire murderers. The net result of the man's economical habits is to increase the armed forces of the state to which he lends his savings. Obviously, it would be better if he spent the money, even if he spent it in drink or gambling. But I shall be told the case is quite different when savings are invested in industrial enterprises. When such enterprises succeed and produce something useful, this may be conceded. In these days, however, no one will deny that most enterprises fail. That means that a large amount of human labor, which might have been devoted to producing something that could be enjoyed, was expended on producing machines which, when produced, lay idle and did no good to anyone. The man who invests his savings in a concern that goes bankrupt is therefore injuring others as well as himself. If he spent his money, say, in giving parties for his friends, they, we may hope, would get pleasure, and so would all those upon whom he spent money, such as the butcher, the baker, and the bootlegger. But if he spends it, let us say, upon laying down rails for surface cars, in some place where surface cars turn out not to be wanted, it has diverted a mass of labor into channels where it gives pleasure to no one. Nevertheless, when he becomes poor through the failure of his investment, he will be regarded as a victim of undeserved misfortune, whereas the gay spendthrift who spent his money philanthropically will be despised as a fool and a frivolous person. All this is only preliminary. I want to say in all seriousness that a great deal of harm is being done in the modern world by belief in the virtuousness of work, and that the road to happiness and prosperity lies in an organized diminution of work. First of all, what is work? Work is of two kinds. First, altering the position of matter at or near the Earth's surface relatively to other such matter. Second, telling other people to do so. The first kind is unpleasant and ill-paid. The second is pleasant and highly paid. The second kind is capable of indefinite extension. There are not only those who give orders, but those who give advice as to what orders should be given. Usually two opposite kinds of advice are given simultaneously by two organized bodies of men. This is called politics. The skill required for this kind of work is not knowledge of the subjects as to which advice is given, but knowledge of the art of persuasive speaking and writing. It est of advertising. Throughout Europe, though not in America, there is a third class of men, more respected than either of the classes of workers. These are men who, through ownership of land, are able to make others pay for the privilege of being allowed to exist and to work. These landowners are idle, and I might therefore be expected to praise them. Unfortunately, their idleness is only rendered possible by the industry of others. Indeed, their desire for comfortable idleness is historically the source of the whole gospel of work. The last thing they have ever wished is that others should follow their example. From the beginning of civilization until the Industrial Revolution, a man could, as a rule, produce by hard work little more than was required for the subsistence of himself and his family. although his wife worked at least as hard as he did, and his children added their labor as soon as they were old enough to do so. The small surplus of bare necessaries was not left to those who produced it, but was appropriated by warriors and priests. In times of famine, there was no surplus. The warriors and priests, however, still secured as much as at other times, with the result that many of the workers died of hunger. This system persisted in Russia until 1917. He's got a footnote next to that, which I'll address in a bit. And still persists in the East. In England, in spite of the Industrial Revolution, it remained in full force throughout the Napoleonic Wars and until 100 years ago, when the new class of manufacturers acquired power. In America, the system came to an end with the Revolution, except in the South, where it persisted until the Civil War. A system which lasted so long and ended so recently has naturally left a profound impress upon men's thoughts and opinions. Much that we take for granted about the desirability of work is derived from this system, and being pre-industrial is not adapted to the modern world. Modern technique has made it possible for leisure, within limits, to be not the prerogative of small privileged classes, but a right evenly distributed among the community. The morality of work is the morality of slaves, and the modern world has no need of slavery. It is obvious that in primitive communities, peasants left to themselves would not have parted with the slender surplus upon which warriors and priests subsisted, but would have either produced less or consumed more. At first, sheer force compelled them to produce in part with the surplus. Gradually, however, it was found possible to induce many of them to accept an ethic according to which it was their duty to work hard, although part of their work went to support others in idleness. By this means, the amount of compulsion required was lessened, and the expenses of government were diminished. To this day, 99% of British wage earners would be genuinely shocked if it were proposed that the king should not have a larger income than a working man. The conception of duty, speaking historically, has been a means used by the holders of power to induce others to live for the interests of their masters rather than for their own. Of course, the holders of power conceal this fact from themselves by managing to believe that their interests are identical with the larger interests of humanity. Sometimes this is true. Athenian slave owners, for instance, employed part of their leisure in making a permanent contribution to civilization, which would have been impossible under a just economic system. Leisure is essential to civilization, and in former times, leisure for the few was only rendered possible by the labors of the many. But their labors were valuable, not because work is good, but because leisure is good. And with modern technique, it would be possible to distribute leisure justly without injury to civilization. Modern technique has made it possible to diminish enormously the amount of labor required to secure the necessaries of life for everyone. I keep wanting to say necessities, but he says necessaries.
I hear that.
I'm like want to say it. This was made obvious during the war. At that time, all the men in the armed forces and all the men and women engaged in the production of munitions, all the men and women engaged in spying, war propaganda, or government offices connected with the war, were withdrawn from productive occupations. In spite of this, the general level of well-being among unskilled wage earners on the side of the Allies was higher than before or since. The significance of this fact was concealed by finance. Borrowing made it appear as if the future was nourishing the present. But that, of course, would have been impossible. A man cannot eat a loaf of bread that does not yet exist. The war showed conclusively that, by the scientific organization of production, it is possible to keep modern populations in fair comfort on a small part of the working capacity of the modern world. If, at the end of the war, the scientific organization, which had been created in order to liberate men for fighting and munition work, had been preserved, and the hours of the week had been cut down to 4, all would have been well. Instead of that, the old chaos was restored. Those whose work was demanded were made to work long hours, and the rest were left to starve as unemployed. Why? Because work is a duty, and a man should not receive wages in proportion to what he has produced, but in proportion to his virtue as exemplified by his industry. This is the morality of the slave state, applied in circumstances totally unlike those in which it arose. No wonder the result has been disastrous. Let us take an illustration. Suppose that at a given moment a certain number of people are engaged in the manufacture of pins. They make as many pins as the world needs, working, say, 8 hours a day. Someone makes an invention by which the same number of men can make twice as many pins. Pins are already so cheap that hardly any more will be bought at a lower price. In a sensible world, everybody concerned in the manufacturing of pins would take to working 4 hours instead of 8, and everything else would go on as before. But in the actual world, this would be thought demoralizing. The men still work 8 hours, there are too many pins, some employers go bankrupt, half the men previously concerned in making pins are thrown out of work. There is, in the end, just as much leisure as the other plan, but half the men are totally idle, while half are still overworked. In this way, it is ensured that the unavoidable leisure shall cause misery. All round, instead of being a universal source of happiness. Can anything more insane be imagined? The idea that the poor should have leisure has always been shocking to the rich. In England, in the early 19th century, 15 hours was the ordinary day's work for a man. Children sometimes did as much, and very commonly did 12 hours a day. When meddlesome busybodies suggested that perhaps these hours were rather long, they were told that work kept adults from drink and children from mischief. When I was a child, shortly after urban working men had acquired the vote, certain public holidays were established by law, to the great indignation of the upper classes. I remember hearing an old duchess say, "What do the poor want with holidays? They ought to work." People nowadays are less frank, but the sentiment persists and is the source of much of our economic confusion.
Let them eat cake.
Let us for a moment consider the ethics of work frankly, without superstition. Every human being of necessity consumes, in the course of his life, a certain amount of the produce of human labor. Assuming as we may that labor is on the whole disagreeable, it is unjust that a man should consume more than he produces. Of course, he may provide services rather than commodities, like a medical man, for example. But he should provide something in return for his board and lodging. To this extent, the duty of work must be admitted, but to this extent only. I shall not dwell upon the fact that, in all modern societies outside the USSR, many people escape even this minimum amount of work, namely all those who inherit money and all those who marry money. I do not think the fact that these people are allowed to be idle is nearly so harmful as the fact that wage earners are expected to overwork or starve. If the ordinary wage earner worked 4 hours a day, there would be enough for everybody and no unemployment, assuming a certain very moderate amount of sensible organization. This idea shocks the well-to-do because they are convinced that the poor would not know how to use so much leisure. In America, men often work long hours even when they are well off. Such men naturally are indignant at the idea of leisure for wage earners, except as the grim punishment of unemployment. In fact, they dislike leisure even for their sons. Oddly enough, while they wish their sons to work so hard as to have no time to be civilized, they do not mind their wives and daughters having no work at all. The snobbish admiration of uselessness, which in an aristocratic society extends to both sexes, is, under a plutocracy, confined to women. This, however, does not make it any more in agreement with common sense. The wise use of leisure, it must be conceded, is a product of civilization and education. A man who has worked long hours all his life will become bored if he becomes suddenly idle. But without a considerable amount of leisure, a man is cut off from many of the best things. There is no longer any reason why the bulk of the population should suffer this deprivation. Only a foolish asceticism, usually vicarious, makes us continue to insist on work in excessive quantities now that the need no longer exists. I will make another reminder. This is 1932 when this was written.
That's right as the Depression was ending, right? Or
it was just pre-World War II. Yeah, it was just when that was getting.
Or wait, maybe it wasn't.
I know, I'm trying to remember the exact.
I have it somewhere short.
Maybe it was just getting started, in fact. Because you had the roaring 20s and the dirty 30s, right?
29 is when
Jump in real quick.
Yeah.
29.
She wanted to jump in real quick with the thing. We're kind of
It's from this book called Perfectly Legal by David K. Johnston about like the legal loopholes and tax corruption that goes on. And it says when governments set tax rates, they're making decisions about who will prosper and by how much. A government that takes 90 cents of each dollar above a threshold, as the U.S. did in the Eisenhower years, is deciding to limit the wealth that people can accumulate from their earnings. Likewise, a government that taxes the poor on their first dollar of wages, as the U.S. does with the Social Security and Medicare taxes, is deciding to limit or eliminate the ability of those at the bottom of the income ladder to save money and improve their lot in life.
Of course, I would make the commentary that for the social good that you limit the amount of wealth somebody can accumulate. I don't see any moral right to having unlimited wealth. Unlimited amounts of resources. If you're saying that, then you're saying that one person can own 99% of the resources and leave the rest of us to starve.
Yeah.
Because and if you're not saying that, then we're just arguing a matter of degree at that point, aren't we?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah.
Would you like to try and synthesize what you're trying to say through the
What's that? Well, essentially,
kind of summarize it. Or answer the question, what's the point?
We talk a fair amount. Well, basically, even in 1932, it was scientifically evident that we did not have to have everyone working in order for us to live very comfortably.
Right.
And in fact, if you look at the difference in productive capacity,
Way more now.
and one of my areas of particular interest is technological advance and like patterns in technological advance.
Right.
And our automative capabilities are so high. I wrote a paper on this. I probably don't even have on this laptop, but I wrote a big research paper on this recently, which is essentially that we don't even need humans to work in fast food restaurants right now. They're automatable. They're already doing it in Japan. Most things you can buy in a store, they have in kiosks. They have live lobster you can buy out of vending machines in Japan.
Oh my God.
I mean, I know that's a little ridiculous.
No, this is the point. That automation, when you put it out 50 years, 100 years.
No, not even that. 10 years, max. We won't need any human labor in 10 years max.
The point
Started in
being that automation is going to make work less
So I guess that would
and
be
less
like the beginning.
necessary. The
Yes.
more people and less work means what? Means we need to restructure our system of government.
Absolutely.
Restructure the
Our
entire
thinking.
assumptions that go into the economic process as it's been going on for the past couple of hundred years. It needs a rethinking process.
Well,
And that's where we should be.
the monetary economy depends upon constant consumption, and people can no longer consume when they're no longer employed. And because of, I mean, even in the 1930s, he's talking about it, to a much larger degree today, there's certainly this thing called technological unemployment.
Yes.
So, as a human race, we're competing for a smaller and smaller and smaller batch of jobs. So,
Absolutely.
as people become unemployed, they can no longer consume. And if they can no longer consume, the entire monetary economy shuts down.
And they're dealing with this back in the 60s, talking about materialism, consumerism, the ugly destruction of the entire planet by people what? Put a big paradise and put up a parking lot. That was our theme song because it seemed to us that the world was getting uglier and more commercial, more materialistic, farther and farther away from the roots. We were going out saying, you know, we're going to go out and live on a farm. We're going to put it all away. Forget electricity. We'll do it all ourselves. We'll live out in the wilderness and live real lives. And that was the greatest threat, I think, the hippies and the counterculture often. They're saying, we don't want your materialism. We'd rather live in a cabin somewhere with a bunch of friends playing music, sitting around and they said, and I'm saying, you are criminals. You're breaking down our very system. You're telling us that everything we're doing is wrong. And you're saying, and we said, yes, exactly. Exactly. And they said, we must die. And it happened. We were ridiculed, we were disenfranchised, we were marginalized, we were turned into a joke. And it's happening all over. But the same spirit of dematerializing, that this is we've created an ugly, materialistic world, the values are all turned upside down, we're not living for anything that means anything anymore, and everybody's saying, not how did we get there, but how do we get out of here?
Well, we're dealing with a lot of symptoms that result from the monetary economy. The monetary economy depends upon cyclical consumption. Cyclical consumption is at odds with efficiency. You think about designing a product and building a product. You can't design a product to last. You can't design a product from the best materials known to man, because it wouldn't be cost competitive, you wouldn't be able to sell it, and if it lasts forever, no one would ever consume another one.
See, now the trick with that is that you have to tug those economic levers to slip. You know what result you want. You want extremely durable goods. So how do we get to where we're incentivized to make extremely durable goods and penalized for making non-durable goods? One way is like product take back, where you say that you have to pay for the end disposal of everything you produce.
Right, waste.
And what that does is it encourages extremely modular design. It encourages reuse of materials.
What's that phrase again? I've heard that before, but it's been a long time.
What's it? It's called product take back. It's where you're responsible for all the waste produced by your. And I agree that consumption in and of itself, as being like a measure of GDP, saying that we are more successful because there's more consumption. At one point in time that was true, but now we have a situation where our economies have overwhelmed our global ecology. And now we need to develop a new integrated system between that. And that's where you get into that resource-based economy. Resource-based economy is a good example of trying to mesh some ecological, economical
it's important, I think, that products are designed and developed and produced in the most resource efficient way rather than the most cost efficient way. Because when cost efficiency is the measure of your success of your product, then you're rewarded by cutting corners and using crappy products. And so you come out, planned obsolescence, you come out with a product that's a piece of crap right off the shelf. Right? Because that's the only way that whatever company is producing that product can continue to sell more and more and more, and upgrade it. And by the way, they all wear out and they all need to be serviced. That generates income for another sector of the entire society in a monetary economy. The service sector. People need to repair and service products. If products were designed in an efficient way that were durable and didn't break down, didn't wear out, didn't become obsolete, that part of the monetary economy would shut down. Cyclical consumption would shut down. Our monetary economy as a whole would collapse.
And I have to bring up what we did in the 60s when they said nuclear power is an answer. Well, not if you consider the waste. Not if you put into the accounting, get on the books. What are you going to do with this stuff? Just add the numbers, leave the health out of it.
I'm going to go take a slightly contrarian position on that, is that coal puts out more radioactive material than nuclear power does per kilowatt hour.
Really? What, radioactive?
Yes, because all that they're not. It's not like they're getting pure crap in there. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff in coal veins. That's where all the mercury in the fish comes from. That's where all the cadmium poison in the rivers comes from. That's all from. The EPA only just started regulating mercury emissions in coal plants like a year or two ago, something like that. It's crazy. Like, if you think about it, mercury, there is no known safe level of mercury in your system, or lead, or cadmium. Those are all like, even the tiniest bit is bad. You do
Where do
not
they come
want
from?
even
Mercury emission of where?
from coal-fired power plants.
Energy on this planet is nothing but abundant. They talk about geothermal being able to produce 4,000 years of electricity for this planet. They talk about being able to harness just 1/10,000th part of the solar energy hitting this planet would be enough to meet all of our energy needs.
I think it's 14,000. Sorry, that's one of my like weird. I know it's
anyway. Energy is nothing but abundant on this planet, but we're led to believe by the energy industry, which is the largest industry on the planet, we're led to believe that energy is scarce. Why? Because in a monetary economy, scarcity means value. The more you can convince the public that something is scarce, there's not a lot of it to go around, the more you can hike up the price.
Supply and demand.
And so, yeah, and part of the problem with that is you have transparent. One thing that allows that to occur is lack of transparency. We're really not aware of how much of everything there is. No one's accountable for that. They can say that that's how we get, when I was referring to the supply shock, for example, an oil supply shock has a very specific, like, measurable effect on things, the way that works. Like it really, and the people who control the strings, I mean, they have the ability to put us through a supply shock in that very easily.
So those industries can deliberately withhold production to make their products more scarce, or they can be dishonest about the availability of their resources to make their products seem more scarce. Both of those behaviors are rewarded in a monetary economy. Both of those are rewarded because more profits.
Yeah.
More scarcity equals more profits.
Isn't one of the issues the difference between the free market economy and all the free market theories and the social engineering thought that we could actually engineer systems that work better, that are more humane, that are more equal, that
abundance,
wealth amongst people,
equality, humanity,
like
no
the share
matter
culture.
What their actual contribution is, that there should be no beggars, there should be no brothers, there should be no starving, no matter what we have to offer the society.
Right.
Towards the curse of social engineering, which means getting together and saying, how can we make this thing work?
Right. So all of us sitting around this table recognize that there are starving people in this world, right? And I think all of us around this table believe that shouldn't be. None of us wants people to starve. None of us wants people to starve or die because they don't have enough money to afford food or health care. But it's hard to convince, especially Americans, who are doing pretty well financially. The monetary system is working pretty well for most Americans, especially relative to people in, I don't know, Africa. But I recently thought of something that I think will be helpful in talking to the average Joe American, and that is, why should I care? I'm doing fine. Why do I care about 35,000 people dying every day of starvation and preventable disease? It doesn't affect me. I'm okay. But the problem that results from a system of depravity, when you have a huge population of the planet that's more and more depraved, dying, starving, they get pissed off. Then comes terrorism. I mean, you think about terrorism, the United States global corporatization of the planet creates terrorists in that we set up systems in other countries that deprive people. We make these huge loans to these countries, the money of which goes all to our own corporations to build infrastructure and crap that they don't need. And then these countries are left with this huge debt that they can't pay off. And that country, the population of those countries start to starve, that creates a negative feeling towards Americans in the U.S. So if we don't take care of everyone on this planet, we create terrorists. We create a situation for us that's not safe. I mean, think about living in Sacramento. If the shit hits the fan, people are going to be out on the streets with guns. And I have a good amount of money, and I got food in my fridge, but I can't stop someone who's putting a gun to my head and saying, give me all the food in your fridge. So it's about safety.
Well, you're saying it's a matter, a question of self-interest. And the system of competition for scarce resources, some get it, some don't, winners versus losers, you
Right.
can't pick winners, you can't pick losers. This is the old free market system, which I think is coming into question now across this whole planet. Everybody's looking at it and saying, this works very well for some people, not at all well
Right.
for most people.
Right.
And the people selling it to us are the ones who are profiting from it. We're just not buying it.
Right.
We're not exactly sure what went wrong or how we got here, but we know this is not right.
And then so to clarify,
Because we believe in a community of human beings that are not in competition with each other to see who can get the most resources and devil take the hindmost. What makes us humans is community, that we take care of each other,
Right.
kind of like
Right.
a big human family.
Right.
And we don't cast people aside because they don't have the skills that we have. We don't say, well, that's
Right.
my sister, but she's kind of a little disabled and, you know, we really don't need her. So if she's picking through the garbage for cat food, well, you know, that's just the way the system works. And we're saying, no, this cannot stand.
Yeah, and to-
we're not exactly sure how we're going to get there, but we're going to have a community again.
right, and if I could propose a clarification to what you just said, which I totally agree with, the system that is under question, the system that people are revolting against, the system that leaves the haves and the have-nots, that leaves so many people out of the equation, that creates so many losers in the world. That system is, I believe, the monetary economy. It's a system of money. Money is the problem.
Well, if I can just...
Yeah.
I want to touch on both things. You were talking about, you know, well, how can we get the average Joe to care about, you know, beyond what they're going through? And you know what, to be realistic, if we're going on, like, you know, whether it's affecting you as a person or not, then I wouldn't be here. Because right now it's not affecting me at all.
Me either.
My mom's an attorney, I'm fine.
Right.
You know, but the fact is, my mom wasn't always well off. You know, she was one of 5 very poor kids, and she worked her butt off to put herself through school. She's, you know, Hispanic, so she picked tomatoes, she cleaned houses, she walked the dogs. So, you know, she worked her butt off to get where she is. And so even lots of us, or upper middle class, we're only that
On the
way
winning side.
because somebody along the line in our family worked their butt off, and we owe it to contribute to the system that allowed us to get to where we are. And in terms of terrorism, you know, we say, oh, you know, we're fighting this war on terror, and like you said, we contributed
We
to
created
this
it.
very system this very thing that we're fighting against, and we continue to contribute it by bombing these people and creating hate because they see their loved ones die around them. We're only making it worse, you know? So that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, I agree. And so you're saying that you're maybe more on the winning side of the equation than the losing side of the equation in terms of money and your personal well-being in this system. And yet, despite that, you still join the movement. You're still I think what you're saying is
I
that
haven't even qualified for financial aid until this
Right.
past November
Right.
because I just turned 24.
So-
my mom makes too much money.
So I
And
think
I'm
there
fine
are.
with that.
So I think there may be a vast majority of people, even in the United States, even that they're on the winning side of the equation slightly or greatly, that will still feel compelled to join the movement,
Yeah.
still feel compelled to do something about this system. And I agree, and I'm hopeful that that's the case. I'm just saying that there is also a subset of the population, especially in the United States, that will have that reaction to the things that we talk about. Get out of my face, I don't really care, I'm doing fine, check it out, Mercedes, whatever, see ya, I gotta get back to work, or I gotta go, on my vacation.
So we have to start talking about values. That's important. That people,
Right, but some people won't care.
Look at hunger and say, it's not really my problem. That is corrupt. That is lame. That is defying the value structure we've been trying to build up for thousands of years. That we're in this together, we care about each other, that no one should be left behind, children out on ice floes just because they're inconvenient. Because all people are valuable, and all people are equally valuable.
And I'm worried that a lot of people won't be on board with that line of thinking. While I'm totally on board with that, I believe that a lot of people will just not care.
We have to be shocked at homelessness. We have to be disgusted by children hungry. We have to share that with the world. We have to say, this cannot stand. It reflects upon us as a people.
Right.
It reflects upon America. People look and see our homeless and they say, this is America, the richest country in the world. You're kidding me.
Right.
How did this happen? How
So-
can you call yourself a Christian nation
Right.
and then ignore the poor and ignore the hungry?
So what I'm
Our
saying is that
country is asleep and needs to be woken up, and this movement is part of the effort to wake them up.
Right. So what I'm saying is another tool that we might have at our disposal with which to wake people up. Beyond all the things that you just mentioned, which I think are very valuable, and I use those kinds of tools in my own toolbox as I'm an activist for the Zeitgeist Movement, or an activist for Occupy, or I'm out there doing the work and talking to people. That's a tool. I think another effective tool that we can have in our toolbox is scaring the shit out of people, right? Because, you're going to have people that say, I don't care, starving people, I don't care, poor people, I don't care, I'm doing fine. They're going to reject every tool that you have, everything that you talk to them about, and then you can say, well, wait a second, you know what, if we don't do something about this, guess what? There's going to be riots in the streets. There are going to be people at your door of your nice mansion in Fair Oaks with, shotguns.
That's exactly what religion and the government accomplished. They used
The what?
the government and their war against terrorism. That's what they're using here.
Right.
And it is very effective, as we can all see. And the same thing with, religion to control the masses. No offense to any religion here, but a large part of their, message uses fear, to control people. So I think they're very effective